Hello and welcome to another edition of Betfair's Trade Talk. Another big weekend of footy. I'm here with Daz to talk about it all. Carlton finally on the winners board. Michael Voss, a sense of relief for him. GWS are on absolute fire at the moment. The 11th win in a row for Port Adelaide. Did you have a highlight for the weekend, Daz?
Yeah, I think that the most impressive performances were Port Adelaide, as you mentioned, coming from 4 goals down to just steamroll Geelong. 11 wins in a row. They go to their bye on top of the ladder. Credit also to Dangerfield in that game.
Unbelievable.
I know Geelong have lost, and that's the story out of it. But to play with a partially collapsed lung, which happened in the first half, mind you, so it was a fair chunk of time. That's a gutsy effort. And I guess it depends what the bigger story was. The Giants finally getting some reward for being competitive at home, or how bad Fremantle were in that game. And then obviously the Tigers with Trent Cotchin starring in his 300th game, keeping their season alive.
It's strange to think about GWS. Over the past couple of years, they haven't been going too well. Obviously, were always a stalwart in the finals for the 5 years preceding or something like that. But they still had this incredible list. Like you've got Kelly, Whitfield, Green, all as part of your team, but they just weren't firing. But all their stars are back, aren't they?
Yeah, and this year, I mean, if you look at their home games, they lost to Carlton by 10 points. Controversial free kick for dissent paid in that game. They lost to St Kilda by 12. They lost to the Bulldogs by about 15. They lost to Richmond by a kick in the last minute. They lost to Brisbane by 3 goals. So they've been really good at home without winning. They did beat Adelaide back in round 1. So they've been so close to getting one of these sides, and they got on a roll, and Fremantle just weren't able to respond. So you could see it coming, but probably not to that magnitude.
So Fremantle obviously not going that well. They started poorly, then got into a purple patch, pardon the pun, and now they're back out of form. What does Longmuir got to do, Justin, to get his boys back up and about? I heard reports earlier in the year that some of the midfield group actually went to Justin Longmuir and said, hey, you got to let us play with a little bit more freedom, and that's where we saw some of their wins. But what have Fremantle got to do to get back in form?
Yeah, they've been the ultimate Jekyll and Hyde team. Obviously, in the first couple of rounds, they got beaten by North Melbourne at the start of the season, which really hurt them. They were 2-5 and basically season shot to bits. They then won 4 in a row, good wins over Geelong at home. They beat Melbourne at the MCG, which was a super win. Beat Sydney at the SCG as well. But the bye's just come at a bad time for them. They lost in the wet to Richmond. The Tigers play the wet very well. Fremantle not so much. And then obviously a shocker on the weekend. So I'm not sure if it's panic stations, because it's been one really bad performance in the last 6 weeks. But given they were chasing the season already, it puts them behind the 8 ball with some tricky fixtures to come.
I loved what Ross Lyon had to say after St Kilda's loss to Richmond, which we're going to talk about in a moment. But he said he's never seen the competition more equal. And it really, a lot of the time, comes up to the day. And we're going to talk about Richmond and St Kilda. And that was just horrible conditions at the MCG. The sheets of rain falling on the broadcast was hauntingly beautiful a little bit. But if you're a fan there, you would have definitely been in the elements. But I love what he has to say about the competition. Like, it is so equal. And I think, paraphrasing, he said, you could get a team on their off day, and then obviously they can lose, but you could also get them in their suited weather conditions, and Richmond certainly got that with the rain coming down.
Yeah, they did, and obviously when it was dry, they kicked 6 in a row at the end, or 5 in a row at the end of the first quarter, and then when the rain came, they were able to really shut the game away. They adapted to the conditions quicker. It suits their style of play, where it's a bit more chaotic, where it's force it forward, slap it, punch it forward, kick it into space, and they certainly adjusted to those conditions better. They're playing with a lot of spirit. Obviously, 62,000 there for Cotchin's 300th. And yeah, the rain, as you say, it was a beautiful sight. When you're 3 or 4 goals down, it's not great when the conditions look like that. But yeah, St Kilda rallied late in that third quarter, and then Richmond, through the likes of Taranto, who we'll talk about a bit later in the program, is really sort of sweeping through. And the Tigers made a similar run last year. That they've got the key fixtures for them in the run home. If they've lost 7 games, they've got to play Brisbane at the Gabba, Port Adelaide in Adelaide, and Melbourne. They probably have to win one of those matches if they're going to make the finals.
We also should mention that it was a terrific coaching performance from Mick Walter, putting Cotchin back into the midfield. I think the Saints were trying to go with Shea Bolton for a little bit, which actually released Dustin Martin. Some insight that I hadn't actually seen until I watched some footy programs and they brought it up. So yeah, some terrific coaching by Mick Walter there. The big one, relief for Michael Voss. The Blues were brilliant against the Gold Coast Suns. That second quarter set them up. People did think that the Blues were quite flat in the first, but I think they were doing a really good job in trying to quell the Gold Coast attack, and they obviously didn't let score get on the board. So yeah, the Blues obviously a very, very good performance.
It's amazing what happens when you break the shackles. They've been kicking 6 to 8 goals a game for about 7 weeks. They then kicked 9 in 25 minutes in the second quarter to blow that game apart. And we spoke about the Giants and Fremantle being 50% one story, 50% the other. Clearly the Gold Coast failed a test at the MCG, which they needed to pass, and their draw gets tougher. But Carlton, we kept saying it every week that they were playing football that suggested they were close to winning a game. They just kept finding ways to lose, or they couldn't finish their work. And so again, that's not hugely surprising that it did click for them. If you look at their draw over coming weeks, they've got the likes of Hawthorn and some teams like that. So they could conceivably get on a bit of a roll, and then you just wonder what that looks like for Michael Voss. Obviously, they're not going to make the 8, but whether they finish with enough of a flurry that there's some optimism going into next year.
Even in those games where you thought that they might steal a win here or there, they were still only kicking that 50 to 60 point range. And I felt as a big watcher of the Blues that most of those goals actually came from free kicks and really dumb luck. But I think the main positive that you can take out of the weekend was the Blues were just free-flowing the ball into forward 50. They were hitting targets. They were lowering their eyes. Jack Martin got subbed out of the game, but he lowered his eyes a couple of times under pressure to hit targets to players who subsequently went on and kicked goals. So as a Blues supporter or people watching, you have to be pretty happy with the way that the criticism came from the Blues not lowering their eyes, and they were really, really having a crack and hitting targets inside their forward 50. And it came off the back of one of the better deep dives that we did. Daz, I think Michael Voss was listening in last week.
Well, he picked from your criteria, the 5-5-13, yeah.
Absolutely. I thought Sam Doherty played a lot more across half back. He had spells on the wing just to help out. I think they definitely released Saad. He had lots of touches. The big one, though, was Brodie Kemp playing undersized on Levi Casbolt, who kicked a goal early. But Kemp had probably the best game of his career post that. It was definitely a very good performance. And his run with Sincotta off the half-back flank was something that the Blues supporters, and especially Michael Voss, would be really happy with. Speaking of deep dives, Daz, we're going to continue the deep dives, and we're actually going to talk about Port Adelaide this week. And
you probably don't need as much help as Carlton, but we'll have a look.
Well, we're going to look at the teams that aren't going so well, and then the teams that are going so well, just what's hot and cold at the moment in AFL. And look, Port Adelaide, 11 wins in the row. Ken Hinkley has got them absolutely firing. Daz, talk to us about some of those high-level stats and some of the reasons why you think Port Adelaide are going so well this year.
Yeah, when we did the preview at the start of the year, we looked at their concerns being their record against the top 8 last year and their record outside of Adelaide last year. They were 2-9 against top 8 sides last year. They beat the Bulldogs and Sydney both at the Adelaide Oval. And they were 3-7 in away matches last year. So obviously, if you maintain that profile, they're not going to make the finals. But this year, they're 5-2 against the top 8. So the losses were to Collingwood in round 2 and to Adelaide, their crosstown rivals. They've also beaten both of last year's grand finalists who are not in the 8 at the moment in Geelong and Sydney. And the Sydney win was away. And away from the Adelaide Oval, they're 5-1. So they've been able to win games at Marvel Stadium against St Kilda and the Bulldogs, who are both in the 8. They've beaten Sydney in Sydney. They obviously beat North Melbourne in Tasmania as well. And they had another strong victory away from home a couple of weeks ago as well. So that they've been in really solid form outside of Adelaide and obviously backing up that home run as well. The other key stats, so last year, obviously, their profile was non-top 8. They were 10th for clearances, 12th for contested ball, 11th for inside 50s, 9th for tackles and they were the 12th highest scoring team in the comp. So this year they're now the highest scoring team in the league. They're number 1 for inside 50s, number 2 from tackles, up from 9 last year, number 4 for contested possessions, up from 12, and number 3 from clearances, up from 10. So top 4 in all statistical categories, when last year they were sort of bottom 6.
Yeah, those stats are absolutely crazy, Daz, and it's no wonder that they're going so well this year. It's definitely no fluke, and you have to put a lot of it down to Ken Hinckley, who surprisingly still hasn't been offered a contract, but something maybe we'll talk about at the end of the show. Tackles number 2 in the AFL of all teams, and only 3 players in the top 50 currently, with Willem Drew, Connor Rozee and Ollie Wines. Daz, I'm going to ask you a question. So I want to go through 3 rated players at Port Adelaide. I'm going to ask you, who do you think are the 3 best performing rated players? And what I mean by rated is they're known around the competition as good players. And then we're going to go into some underrated players. But first, kick us off with your rated players.
So the rated players, Ollie Wines, Brownlow medalist, averaging 23 possessions this year. Then you look at Connor Rozee. There's always been that debate that Kane Corns has had, Rozee versus Walsh and that type of thing. But he's having an outstanding season. And then you throw Zach Butters in, who could be leading the Brownlow medal to this point. And Butters and Rozee, they sort of came through with Dersma as the 3 big kids all at the same time. And obviously Dersma's been injured, but the other 2 have been stars. And Ollie Wines is their flagship player in the middle of the ground at the moment, sort of taking the baton from Travis Boak, who's been such a warrior for them.
Yeah, amazing. And underrated players, you really like the look of Jeremy Finlayson, and he's obviously had a fantastic year too.
He's been so important for them. Given they had Dixon out for about 6 weeks, Marshall's missed several games with concussion and various other things. So Finlayson at times has had to pinch it in the ruck. He's gone behind the ball to take intercept marks, and he's kicked, I think, 9 in the last 2 weeks. Kicked 5 against Hawthorn, kicked 4 against Geelong the other day. He's been superb in a number of roles for Port, and a big loss for GWS.
Well, he's already kicked 9 more goals than his previous year or first year at Port Adelaide, where he actually had a pretty solid season. He was finding a lot of football, but obviously leading goals for Port Adelaide at the moment and on track for a career best year. The criticism of Port when they were playing finals and those preliminary finals were their forwards. Big forwards weren't standing up in games. They brought over Jeremy Finlayson, which was criticised a little bit given they've got Georgiades, Marshall and Dixon already, who is probably coming into the twilight of his career as well. We forget that Charlie Dixon's 30 plus at the moment. So yeah, Jeremy Finlayson's obviously a fantastic footballer. He gives them that experience, and hopefully in those big games, he's going to be one to step up and becoming a bit of a big Mr. Fix-It for Port Adelaide.
If you had said at the start of the year that Port Adelaide, and that was right, their weakness was the consistency of their key position forwards. If you had said at the start of the year that Dixon would miss 5, Marshall would miss 4, and Georgiades would do his knee and miss the season, you'd think, oh, well, Port are in a fair bit of trouble. But they've been outstanding in finding ways to create avenues to goal. And now Marshall's obviously come back in and had a pretty good month and is only going to strengthen them from here. He's kicked 10 in the last 3 weeks. So
absolutely,
he's humming along now.
Absolutely. Our next underrated player, Dan Houston. What do you know of Dan Houston does?
Yeah, he's been a pretty reliable player for a couple of years, actually, but doesn't get spoken about by comparison to a lot of those other mids. He averaged 24 possessions last year a game. He averaged 22 the year before that when they made a prelim. And this year he's averaging again about 24. He's kicking goals occasionally. He kind of plays that midfield halfback role that we see a lot of guys do, and yeah, he's just been phenomenal, particularly in this 11-game winning streak.
Yeah, I think you'd have to say he's one of the more underrated players, not just at Port Adelaide, but in the competition. He's always bobbing up for Port Adelaide and a very consistent player when they need him. He's increased all his key metrics this year, but the one I want to talk about is metres gained. He's averaged 485 metres gained, which is 143 metres higher than his career average. And that sort of tells me that he's a really attacking player, and he wants to kick the ball long and get it into dangerous spots. And there's no surprises that he's 3rd at Port for inside 50s and 4th at Port for 1%ers does.
Yeah, and he's a kicker, as you say. He leads Port Adelaide for kicks, but ranks about 7th for handballs. So he's very much a receive and kick player. So 215 kicks, leads all comers, 4 ahead of Rozee. He's kicked the ball more than Butters this year as well. But Yeah, and I think that's telling one of those guys that can sort of get on the outside and drive the ball long. Sort of comparing it to, I think the highest kick to handball ratio in the AFL is Wanganeen Miller at St Kilda, but Dan Houston's top 5 for that as well.
And he's obviously hitting the scoreboard as well, which Ken Hinkley would absolutely love. His mid defenders hitting the scoreboard there. The last one we're going to talk about is Willem Drew, and he kind of is that player that we've know his name, and he's been around for a long time, but really he hasn't. He only had his first year or debut game in 2019, does.
Yeah, he's 24, but obviously came along a little bit later, missed all of 2020 with injury, but he's laid nearly 30 more tackles than any other Port Adelaide player this year, and his contested ball numbers are obviously very high. Half of his possessions have actually been contested possessions this season, so it's a credit to him. Obviously, that spells out the type of player he is on the inside of contests.
Yeah, that's it. And Porter obviously second in the AFL for tackles this year. He's the only player in the top 20 in the AFL for tackles. The next best, and he's number 7 ranked there. The next best is Connor Rosie at 29, and then rounding out the top 50, I think, is Wines around that 50 mark. So, look, he's a fantastic player, and he's someone that I would consider a real worker bee. He's not going to be getting Brownlow votes, but you really need those players to win. And when we talk about the bottom half of your best 22, it really is the difference between winning a grand final and losing a grand final. And he certainly is consistent and puts his hand up and has a crack each week. I just want to say that he's averaging elite for tackles this year and increased his average clearances. He doesn't stuff the stat sheet, but he does his job, and that would be an absolute, he would be a coach's pet, I reckon, for Ken Hinkley, and those players are invaluable. Do you see another player around the AFL that's sort of like a Willem Drew?
In terms of players that are a bit like a Willem Drew, it's a tricky one because you don't have those out-and-out sort of dour, probably looking at guys like within that Brisbane side, similar to the role that, say, Mitch Robinson used to play when he was on their list. Even what the Saints are trying to turn, say, Marcus Windhager into as a kid. And Sydney have always had those sort of bigger-bodied, stopping midfielders as well through time. But I would say a bit of a Mitch Robinson type.
The final question, just without notice, before we move on to our market watchdog, Daz, but very loaded question, can Port Adelaide win the flag this year?
They can. Obviously, we'll learn a bit when they play Collingwood again. It is in Adelaide, which only tells part of the story, because obviously they got killed by Collingwood in round 2 by about 73 points, I think it was, at the MCG. So their form has been flawless since that day. So can they come to Melbourne and beat the big teams? Obviously, they'll get a crack at Collingwood in Adelaide. If they can take that scalp, gives them a bit of confidence, and there's no reason to suggest they can't.
100% does. Well, that's our deep dive. Actually, I do also want to say, when they were just starting their role, you told the viewers to back Port in at a ridiculous price on the exchange for top 4. I think it was almost $3, and now they'd be into the $1.20, $1.30 mark, which is a fantastic betting strategy.
The head-to-head with Brisbane for highest ranked non-Victorian team too, that market might as well be closed, I think now. They're about $1.07, I think, in that 2-horse race. So, yeah, obviously the 11 wins in a row wouldn't be something that anyone predicted. But
very astute, Daz. That's why we absolutely love you. Let's head over to the market watchdog. What's caught your eye this week on the exchange, Daz?
So Port, their shortest price for the season for the flag now at $4.70, second favourite. It's interesting, the amount of teams that move when there's a bye, either in or out, or players moving in or out. They can't play. They haven't had a shocker. They can't enhance their case. But a couple that stood out. So Taylor Walker and the Coleman went from $4.80 to $7.40 without Adelaide playing a game. So found that a little bit strange. The top 4 market, I've sort of asked you before, but Brisbane are the 4th favourite for the top 4 at $1.54. The next is Essendon at $5.40. So again, I guess it's that question, is the top 4 done? Although if Brisbane lose to St Kilda on Friday night, they're out of the top 4 probably.
Yeah, it's a crazy market. I mean, that could very well be the top 4 cemented in. I just think that with the evenness of the competition, and certainly there's teams below that top 4 currently that can get a scalp. So Yeah, I think there's definitely value there. It's just where's the value? Essendon, I know you're going to talk about them later. Are they the ones? Not 100% sure. Port were the biggest firmers for the premiership this year. The other big firmers for the top 8 were Essendon, who actually went from $2.18 into $1.52, which was a 20% probability shift in favour of the top 8. So that's a massive firm for Essendon. And we spoke about it weeks ago that they're obviously playing a really good brand of football this year, but they've got a really easy run home after playing that really hard first 10 rounds.
On the ladder predictors that you can do online, they should finish 5th, probably, if you look at their draw from here. Obviously, they've got some tricky games like Port Adelaide at Marvel, Adelaide at the G, even Fremantle in Perth, and Collingwood, I think, later in the season, Geelong at Cardinia Park. But on the balance of probabilities, you'd expect them to win a couple of those, and they should win the rest. So I think they'll be hosting a final in 5th or 6th, the Bombers.
Larky into $7 for the Coleman Daz.
Yeah, which it's obviously going to be very difficult to win that in a side that's going to finish bottom 2 or 3. But he just keeps kicking goals. He had another pretty good game against the Bulldogs. He's a very neat kick for goal, so he doesn't need a stack of chances. But yeah, that's been an interesting market to watch during the bye rounds because it sort of fluctuates around all over the place. And Nick Larkey up to 39 goals now in 14 matches and obviously sitting comfortably inside the top few in the AFL. So can he sustain it in a side that's obviously going to struggle to win games?
100% Daz. Well, we're going to go over to our Brownlow predictions segment and we're going to have a look at the Betfair Brownlow predictor. Daz, we have a new leader, albeit after a bye for Nick Dacos, who's going to play next week, and Richmond are going to have a week off. But Tim Taranto is on top with 20 predicted votes. Nick Dacos in second with 19. Christian Petrarca third with 18.5. They obviously had the bye as well. Zach Merritt, who's ineligible, is on 16.5. Zach Butters, who didn't get any votes in his latest game, is still on 16. I actually saw him shorten for the Brownlow medal, and I don't think he's any chance to get 1, 2 or 3 votes for their game against Geelong. I think he started really well, but was definitely nullified towards the end of the game. Marcus Bontempelli could have a 3-vote game, 2.5. He's predicted on the Betfair Brownlow predictor. He's 15.5 votes and $7 on the exchange does.
Yeah, they've been those Bontempelli and Neal. I think Lachie Neal a good chance to get 3 votes again. I know Zach Bailey played very well in that game, but Lachie Neal, proven vote getter. Bontempelli's had 30 and kicked 3. Obviously, the only threat would be Cody Waitman, who kicked 6. But midfielders will generally get votes over forwards. So, yeah, Taranto, the new leader, but not the new favourite, obviously. So, Dacos still holding favouritism. Taranto, 620 now. So, there's still value around Dacos, who no reason to suggest he won't win it. But Taranto, 620. Petrarca, 760. Lachie Neal still at 21s at the moment, despite that.
Yeah.
I still think there's value around Nick without knocking the young star.
If Lachie Neal goes out and has 40 touches in his next game, you'd have to say that obviously that's a 3-vote game. I mean, you'd hope so, but his price isn't going to be $21. It's going to shorten into single figures, surely.
Yeah, I think so. The interesting one on Lachie Neal this week is that his lowest possession game in the last 2 years was last year against St Kilda when tagged by Marcus Windhager, which will probably happen again this week. Like, he might break the shackles and get 40 and be best on ground. But I still think that even if he is a quieter this week, his price might ease a little bit, and then you get even better value with the amount of games they have at the Gabba in the run home. So there's a few of those that are interesting to watch based on matchups.
Well, Dunkley got the 1 vote, predicted vote in their last game. On the weekend, does Windhager potentially go to Dunkley? He's obviously a very damaging player as well. And
then obviously McCluggage will come back from the concussion for Brisbane as well. So there's a few options, but obviously it's a different coach now. It was Brett Ratton who tagged Neal with Windhager, so Ross Lyon might have a different idea, but they may stick with what they know and think, well, he's done the job on him before, we'll try it again.
Rightio, Daz. Well, that's another Brownlow predictions segment. We're going to head over to buy, hold and sell. Daz, shock buy almost. Essendon for the top 4.
Yeah, like, I'm not saying they'll necessarily make it, but just on the price. So I think the top 3 will definitely finish top 4 in Collingwood, Port Adelaide and Melbourne. Brisbane, the likely 4th place side, but I'm not sure $1.54 versus the $5.40 you'll get on Essendon is quite right. I think it's a little bit closer. And if Essendon beat Fremantle this week and Brisbane don't win, it's conceivable the Bombers are in the top 4 by the end of the round if they win by enough. So I just think $5.40 on Essendon. It should be a little bit shorter than that. So purely on price, because they've got a pretty cushy draw. I think they're a lock to make the 8. I'd be giving them a slight nudge at top 4.
Well, I'm going to buy Geelong this week, which some people also might think is crazy after their performance on the weekend. Look, they've certainly got some injuries and they've obviously lost Patrick Dangerfield again, who's been so terrific for them this year as their first year captain, or his first year as captain. And they're going to bump into an in-form Melbourne. Look, we saw the vision on the weekend. Brad Scott obviously wasn't a happy chap with that very animated display in front of Jeremy Cameron. I doubt he'll let his team play in the same manner. You hope that he would be really firing up his troops to go down to their home ground. It's obviously a fortress for them. How many times has Geelong lost at GMHBA Stadium in the last 5 or 6 years? You're getting $2.16 about them there. I would just be so curious to know when they ever hit a pre-play $2.16 at a game where they're playing at their home ground, GMHBA Stadium.
Yeah, even like any level of outsider, you'd be thinking it's 15 years or more. You're probably going back to 2006 or 7 to find them as an underdog on home soil. So
if the game was at the MCG, I could understand why the odds would be $2.16 or higher even. But at GMHBA, their record there, like that price is just ridiculous. And you can only get it on the Betfair exchange. Absolutely fantastic prices there. Daz, who are you holding on this week?
Only because of what the market has generally done. I'm just holding on Taranto because Richmond have the bye for the Brownlow. So everything about the Brownlow medal market has suggested that when a team hasn't played, their players have drifted ever so slightly. So Taranto's could conceivably be leading the Brownlow. Richmond aren't going to play this week just because of a scheduled bye. Not going to hurt his chances at all. But he's $6.20 now. He could be $7.58 by next week by virtue of having the bye. So just back him next week for me.
Love it, Daz. I'd love to do a little bit of analysis on the market moves according to the bye. It's been crazy, actually. We've had some drifts just because of the bye. There's no real other reason. But I'm going to hold on Carlton. Daz, they obviously belted the Suns. They've got the bye this week. And then they run into an in-form Hawthorn and an out-of-form Fremantle at Optus. Look, a lot can happen in a couple of weeks. After that, they play Port, obviously second or potentially could be first on the ladder by that stage. And then the Eagles, who are all the way down at the bottom. You'd have to say that 3 of those games are seriously winnable if Freo keep on playing the way they're playing. If they're going to win 3 or 4, this is if predicted, they shorten significantly for the top 8. The tricky part comes when they've got to play Collingwood, St Kilda and Melbourne in the following weeks after that. So, look, we'll just have to see what happens with Carlton. That's only a prediction, but if they do win 3 of those 4 games, then it's inevitable that they're going to shorten a hell of a lot for the top 8.
Because they're a busy team on the exchange, big supporter base, popular club, that they can be very active in those markets where, that they can bounce around 100%. A little bit with a lot of money sort of poured into them. So, but a lot of those sides fighting for the 8 are losing games, like Fremantle, like Geelong, even St Kilda, the Bulldogs, those sorts of things. So I guess it's keeping the door ajar a little bit. But yeah, they're going to have to be almost faultless from here to get there.
Who are you selling this week, Daz?
I've done it a few times, but the Tribunal, I know it's incidents are judged differently, but James Sicily would have to be almost the only player in the history of the game to receive a free kick and get suspended for 3 weeks. There were a lot of mitigating circumstances in that tackle, but even the whole process, I mean, he was reported on a Saturday, challenged it, was heard on a Tuesday, appealed it. Hawthorn had the bye, so he was away. So it got settled last night. So that's something like 11 days after the original incident took place. So it was a really messy situation, but I know we don't like to compare, but you go back to, say, the human missile, which was Cozzy Pickett in round 1, where he got 2 weeks for launching himself into, I think it was Bailey Smith. I'm not sure that James Sicily winning a free kick for holding the ball, which unfortunately concussed Hugh McCluggage, would be worth a week more than that.
I've only got the tiniest sell, and I'm doing this really last second. There was an article that went out last week saying, or basically talking about which betting site had the best odds for AFL this season and didn't have the Betfair exchange, which could be as misleading of an article as there has ever been in the history of mankind. The odds on the disposal markets at the moment on the Betfair exchange are absolutely crazy. They're fantastic, and we would be talking about them a lot more, but given that they get loaded in on the day of those games, we don't 100% know which markets you could back or lay. But the prices are outstanding, and we've definitely had a lot of luck on them, and probably something that we could potentially do from a content perspective going forward. But maybe next week we'll bring up some stats about how we can debunk that myth. But it kind of goes to show that there needs to be a little bit more education around the wagering footy industry about what Betfair is, and because if you're not having Betfair in there as number one for best odds on AFL, then the article's just wrong.
Well, just off the top of my head, just like, the average bookie price: Taranto, Brownlow, $5.50, Betfair $6.20, Nick Dacos $3.20, $3.80 on the exchange, Petrarca $7.60 on the exchange. Then some big examples of that, like Jack Sinclair, $41 average price on the exchange, $60. Clayton Oliver, $18.50 as opposed to 15s. There isn't a single player that is better on the corporate average than they are on the exchange.
100%. And just the pure fact that there's obviously no bookie margins built into Betfair's prices. So when it's an even match, like we saw Carlton and Essendon a couple of weeks ago, Carlton were $2, Essendon were $2. It's a fantastic market to bet into. But I was seeing $1.74 on the corporate prices on both sides of the bet. So obviously a bit of education there for some of those sports media outlets. But we're going to go for trading strategies. Who are you looking at backing or laying this week, Daz?
So Betfair throws up the multis. They throw some suggested multis up. I don't mind the Thursday, Friday, Saturday treble. So I agree with what you say on Geelong, but I think that Melbourne will find a way. I think St Kilda probably should be even money with Brisbane. They're slight outsiders, so you get value there. And I think Collingwood will win at the MCG against Adelaide. So you're getting about 5-10 on that treble, Melbourne, St Kilda and Collingwood. So don't mind the value in that. And even though he's still a very good chance to win it, I think that Nick Dacos should be equal favourite with 2 or 3 others for the Brownlow, and he's quite short. So I'd be contemplating laying him in the belief that, a Taranto, a Petrarca, a Bont and Neil might still win it.
If Dacos creeps over $4 once again, I know we put it on the show, he got out to $4.20, and then after a 3-vote game, he went straight back into $3. I'll still continue to put money on Nick Dacos at that $4 mark, but nothing less than that. Like your thoughts about the D Saints and Pies multi. What I would say is, it sounds like we're probably going to have a little bit of a side bet.
Yeah, I think so.
I'm happy to stick with Geelong for that game. Probably a bit of a risk on my part, but
I think there is a equivalent multi with them in it. So I'll see if I can quickly get that one up. The AFL multi on the Cats to win. With pretty much the same scenario. So I'll get that one for you.
So the thinking about the Cats, obviously, is they're playing at GMHBA Stadium. They're $2.16 currently on the exchange. It's a fantastic price, but what's your multi telling you?
Yeah, well, so the multi's suggesting, so you got Geelong and St Kilda at 4.10. Obviously, they haven't got the treble for that one. So if you were to back Collingwood as well, obviously you would add a little bit of value to that. The other one is Geelong and Fremantle. If you think Fremantle are a chance of beating Essendon at about the $1.80, you get nearly $4 on that multi. So, Geelong do fatten the value given they are underdogs at home.
That's right. Daz, we're going to go to our last segment, finish up with our back or lay questions. This statement, back or lay this, Daz, both of last year's grand finalists don't make the finals. Are you backing or laying that?
Hasn't happened since 1963. So that's 60 years ago. That was Essendon and Carlton made the granny in 62 and missed the finals in 63. Sydney will miss, I think, even though they've been in improved form. Geelong, if they lose to Melbourne, fall to 6 and 8 and probably miss the final. So, if they get beaten on Thursday night, then back for sure, which would be a massive surprise. both of those sides so reliable. They probably missed the finals 4 times between them in 25 years or something like that. So it would be a huge turn up, but a distinct possibility.
100% does.
And the question I have for you, Andrew McQualter, he's won 3 out of 4. The only loss was to Port Adelaide by 10 points. Is he a lock to coach Richmond next year?
No, I'm gonna lay that. I definitely don't think he's a lock, and they could still make finals, and I don't think he's a lock. I wouldn't want to put that much pressure on Mick Walter. I think he's still a young coach, and he's probably got a lot to learn about looking after a full football department. Mm-hmm. It's not just your team, but you're really being a leader of your football department and all the staff in it. So I think people underestimate how big a job it is to coach, and then you add Richmond on top of that. And Richmond's obviously an absolutely massive football club. They've got 100,000 members. So yeah, I wouldn't be diving into making Mick Walter your coach just yet, but I had an interesting thought while driving. Can you extend, or could you extend the interim period till like into next season, say? So you can, obviously Mick Walter's going to coach out the rest of the season. Rather than put all the pressure on him for taking over the club full time, next year, if you made that position interim, then it sort of takes the pressure off, and then it also takes the pressure off the club in having to make the right decision. They obviously like Mick Walter around the club. If he was the interim, he could potentially go back into a senior assistant role, and then obviously give the reins over to a new coach. But it's just an interesting thought. What do you think, Daz?
I actually think North Melbourne might end up being a case study in that space, because their scenario is different. Obviously, they haven't sacked Clarkson, and nor has he resigned. He's just stood down. Brett Ratton went from being a part-time employee to a full-time employee. There's been no indications yet that he would want the job full-time if Clarko steps away. Plus, how long's a piece of string? Will Clarkson be back in a month? Will he be back next year? Will he not come back at all? So North might be in that position where they say to Clarko, "Oh, do you want till Christmas?" And then they say to Brett Ratton, "Well, okay, you can handle all the off-season. You keep going through, no guarantees." So yeah, Richmond might be able to look at that as a potential blueprint. And McQualter's not the first coach to get a spike out of a team as a caretaker. It happens quite a bit. They do seem to like him, but yeah, there's probably a little bit to play out.
Well, we don't want to. That's the thing. We don't want to ruin his career.
Correct.
Off a spike, because a lot of most of the time, I know that there's occasions where it doesn't happen, but most of the time, if you do get sacked from a coaching job, you won't become a senior coach ever again. I think the really sad case of a coach who probably won't become a senior coach again is Brendan Bolton, because I think he definitely deserves to become a senior coach. But I think just with the circumstances with Carlton, he got sacked. You wouldn't want the same thing to happen to Mick Walter.
And digressing in that, AFL is almost the only sport in the world where coaches very rarely get second and certainly not third chances. You look in the English Premier League, you'll find managers that have been sacked 9 times, and they just keep. It stands to reason in every job you do that you're going to be better at it second time around. It doesn't matter what profession that is. And the amount of coaches who might be retired for 3 years as a player, then become a senior coach in their mid-30s, and then they're done. Like it's logical that they're going to be better for more experience. So yeah, you would hope that whatever happens in that situation, that they'll get those additional look-ins.
Yeah, really interesting conversation, Daz. Well, that's all we got time for this loaded edition of AFL Trade Talk. For all our trading strategies and to watch the full show, head to the Betfair Hub now.
What's gambling really costing you? For free and confidential support, call the number on the screen or visit the website.